Welcome to our bloom thinning webinar. So my name is Mike Baisdow. I'm a tree fruit extension specialist with the Eastern New York Commercial Horticulture Program. I'm based in Plattsburgh, New York. Our team covers the 17 counties in Eastern New York, going from the Quebec border down to the New Jersey border. And I'm based all the way up in the north. I just want to also give a shout out to the Northern New York Ag Development Program. They're helping us out with a bloom thinning project here in Peru this season. So I wanted to give them a shout out. Going through the webinar today, just to give you an idea of the process that we're going to have Greg Peck and Dan Olmsted lead most of the discussion on bloom thinning. Once we get through that portion, we'll then also open up the conversation. And if anybody is here to hear about some of Greg's other research, he'll be sticking around a bit so that he can take some questions on that as well. All right, so with that, I'm going to turn things over to Greg Peck. Dr. Peck is an assistant professor of horticulture at Cornell in Ithaca, and his research areas, in addition to bloom thinning, include high-density orchard soil ecology, sustainable orchard management, and hard cider.
All right, well, thanks, Mike. I really appreciate the opportunity to present this webinar. Mike had, for a number of years, been asking me to participate in his winter fruit schools for the Champlain Valley, and it always conflicts with my teaching schedule in the spring semester, so I always say no. This year he said, back in January, I think he said, well, let's just do it by Zoom this year. And so Mike was well ahead of the COVID-19 curve for using Zoom. And we said, oh, it'd be 15, 20 people. And now we are all living in a Zoom universe. And I think close to 80 people, or maybe a few more than 80 people, are on the webinar with us today. So really great to have that kind of exposure and have so many people interested in the research that we've done on bloom thinning. For today's webinar, I will go through some of the background of how the pollen tube growth model was developed, how it's used, and then I'm going to pass it off in a little bit to Dan Olmsted, who is the director of the NUA system at Cornell, which is how most of the people in the eastern United States are going to be accessing the pollen tube growth model. And he'll do a run through about how to actually, the practicalities of actually running the model on that platform. If you see on the screen here, this work while I'm presenting today is actually the work of many, many people. In particular, my Virginia Tech colleagues, Dr. Keith Yoder, Leon Combs, who was Keith's technician for many years and actually did most of the nitty-gritty lab work to create these models. Candace DeLong, who was a master's student with me a number of years ago when I was at Virginia Tech. And actually not on this screen is Ross Byers, who actually came up with this idea originally probably more than 15 years ago, about how we can use pollen tube growth rates to time thinning sprays better in orchards. At Cornell, a number of colleagues, including folks who are on the call today and others who have either worked with me on beta testing and or getting the model implemented into the newest system. So there's a number of other reasons why people have issues with bloom thinning, but I guess spring frost is often one that comes up, and the fear of trying to do some bloom thinning and then a few days later having some sort of frost event and reducing the potential crop load even more so. Lack of empirical data and experience, the timing of the bloom sprays, and that's really the key aspect of the pollen tube growth model. It's really about when to put on the applications. That's the primary thing that the bloom thinning, or that the pollen tube model does. And then lack of materials that don't have side effects. And I'll cover a little bit of that. I've had some conversations with a number of the different companies that are making products that we found to be efficacious for bloom thinning, and give you some updates on that. The pros and the reason why bloom thinning is really good is because and we've known this for decades in pomology, is that the earlier in the season that you reduce the potential crop load, the larger the fruit size is going to be and the greater the return bloom the following year. And so, and that's because as soon as you have pollination and fertilization and seeds start to form in the fruitlets, they start producing plant hormones, gibberellins, auxins, etc., and those compounds will actually inhibit flower bud initiation. So the earlier you get those, you prevent those flowers from turning into fruit, the more likely you are to have flower buds to be initiated for the following year. We've done some work looking at some of these materials because they tend to be caustic, and they originally were developed as fungicides. So if we were to overlay their use as the bloom thinner with their use as a fungicide, when can that work? And that's something we published a paper on that, and I'll go over that a little bit later today, which helps to reduce the number of applications that you might have to put on in a given year, and particularly for organic growers, since these materials tend to be organically approved, that's a real option. And then the pollen tube growth model, which we'll talk more about, helps to have more precise timing for those applications. So just a little reminder on flower anatomy, and what we're talking about is, remember that this is the green part here is the female organs within the flower. And the top here is the stigma. That's where the pollen, actually the pollen grains land. When they land there, there's a number of different things that happen. The pollen grain will get hydrated. It gets some stimulation from plant hormones that are in the stigma, and then that pollen tube will start to grow down the style. That's this long green stalk here. And as that pollen tube grows down, it eventually grows into the ovule, and inside of the ovule is where the egg is, and that's where fertilization happens. So today when I talk about fertilization, or it's being fertilized, I'm talking about the reproductive event. I'm not talking about adding nutrition to the orchard. And then of course this is the male part of the flower here. This is the filament, that's the stalk on the male side, and then this is the anther up top. That's where the pollen is located. So the model was developed by researchers at Virginia Tech for over the course of many years, and we actually came up with a pretty cool system using root bag trees, which allow us to grow the trees in the field. Let's see if I can move this over a little bit. Allows us to, in the top right corner there, to grow the trees in the field inside of these kind of almost like burlap sacks, or a little different than that, but kind of like that. Dig them out in the winter time, and we'd actually some years put them into refrigerated trucks so they could accumulate their winter chill units, and then pull them out of the, once they'd accumulate enough winter chill units to break dormancy, put them into a greenhouse so that they can start to grow and flower. And then we do controlled pollination. Here you can see on each of these trees a number of different colored tags. Each of those was, in this experiment, different pollen sources. We're looking at what the effect was of different pollen sources on the rate of growth of the pollen tubes. And then we can put them into growth chambers. So that's what you're seeing in the bottom middle picture there. And those are two trees inside of a growth chamber. Growth chamber is basically allows us to have control of the temperature, the humidity, other factors, the light levels as well, to be able to do replicated experiments. And so in the buckets there, that's in a greenhouse, we do the controlled pollination. We actually emasculate the flowers first so you don't get any contamination. And then you do your controlled pollination. Once you pollinate the flowers, you put them inside the growth chamber. Usually, most of the time we're doing these for 24 hours. And then after 24 hours, you pull them out of the growth chamber. You can remove the flower at that point. We'd preserve it into a solution. And then when we're ready to do the evaluation of it, we would add a dye that would highlight the color of the pollen tube. And then we can use on the software that comes with a lot of microscopes, be able to measure the length of that pollen tube. And so through this system, we're able to run the growth rate of the pollen tube at different temperatures. So we'd be able to then, by doing this multiple times, number of replications, be able to build the model for at different temperatures, how fast is the pollen tube growing. So just some more pictures along the top there, some that you've seen. The brush picture there is actually, you can see that that flower has been emasculated, and that's actually pollen on the end of that brush that we're doing a controlled pollination. Very similar technique to what apple breeders will do. And then on the far right on the top, you'll see this is what the pollen tubes look like, and they're highlighted in blue with the dye there. There's some pubescence at the bottom there. We're not really looking at that, but you can see the blue arrow at the darker blue arrow at the bottom. And you can see how we measure the pollen tubes. So this is 8.3 millimeters, for example. And so on the bottom left, you can see the on the x-axis going across on the bottom, temperatures in degrees Fahrenheit. And then on the y-axis, this is the actual growth rate in millimeters per hour. And so at different temperatures, you can see that we get different growth rates. And so they tend to be very slow as you're cold, right? And then as temperatures warm up, the pollen tube growth rate increases. So that's fairly intuitive. And you can see at some point in here, it's just a little bit shy of 80 degrees Fahrenheit, the growth rate tends to slow down. And this is really common in a lot of biological systems, is that there's kind of an ideal temperature, and then at some point it gets too hot and growth rate actually starts to slow down. And so the ideal growth rate for Fuji would be about 80 degrees, just shy of 80 degrees, for example. And so you can see here, this is how these models were developed, and we had to do this over and over again for each of the different varieties that we were working with, because there were enough differences among different varieties. And the Fuji would be the maternal variety, not the pollen source, but rather the variety of apple that you're growing in your orchard. Okay, so then on the right-hand side here, how do we translate that to something practical, something that growers can use? Because people like me get really excited by the physiology of this, and it's kind of cool to just measure pollen tube growth rates, and I'm generally interested in that kind of thing. But for a practical use, how do you translate this into something that can be used for crop load management? So the way this works is on the bottom here, we'll start there, is temperature. And you can see this is diurnal temperatures. So this is the high temperature during the day, low temperature at night. And you can see it kind of swinging up and down over the course of several days here. And so that then gets translated into the pollen tube growth rate. So this is what the model looks like when it's implemented into the NUA website. And so as temperatures are on the lower end, a bit cooler, you can see growth rates are slow. And then you can see as we get across here, as temperatures start to warm up, you can see the growth rate increases here. Okay, so it's using the equation from the graph that you see on the left-hand side to translate the temperatures that you see on the bottom into the pollen tube growth rates that you see in the top. Okay, so some interesting things here we need to think about. One is, when do you start the clock? When do you start the model? Okay, so that's where the little red pointer is. When do you put your application spray on? Okay, so this would be the first spray here. And then the clock automatically resets to 0 and runs again. When do you put that second spray on? Do you need a third spray? Okay, so these are some of the things to know. And then so this is the x-axis is day and time. And then on the vertical axis or the y-axis is the percent of the style length. Okay, so we use style length to calculate when to start the model and when to stop the model. So style length then again is from the top of the stigma, if you look on the top right, to the bottom of the style, okay? And this is our style length. Okay, so this is our starting point. This is where the race starts, the stigma. This is the finish line at the bottom, okay? So we're gonna assume the finish line is fertilization, right? So pollination and then fertilization. And so what we're watching here then is we're assuming this is when, at the start on May 5th at 12 o'clock, this is when we started the model. So we assumed at this point there were enough flowers open. We're usually thinking about king bloom flowers. There are enough of them open on the tree or in the orchard to start the clock. Okay, so this is when the last flower that we want to turn into an apple for the growing season is open and receptive to pollen. And then we start the clock, and it's using these calculations on that model on the left. And then this is 100% here. It's got up to 111%. When we get to 100%, that's when the pollen tube length is equal to the style length. Okay, because at that point, we're assuming that that last flower that we wanted to be part of our crop for that year is going to be fertilized and turn into an apple. At that point, we do not want any more flowers to turn into apples. So we put on some sort of thinning spray. Typically, we're using something caustic, lime sulfur, ammonium thiosulfate or ATS. We've found some good use with a Maroon Bioscience biofungicide called Regalia, which is a knotweed extract. And then we allow another wave of flowers to get pollinated after that caustic thinner went on. Those pollen tubes are growing. But at this point, we do not want those pollen tubes to reach the length of the style, because we do not want any of these flowers that are open at this point in time, May 9th at whatever time that is, 3 o'clock or so. We don't want any of those flowers to turn into fruit. So we don't allow them to reach the base of the style and fertilize the flowers. So that's why we stop it at 70%.
Hey, Greg, can I ask you a question from Chris?
Yeah, go ahead.
So Chris is wondering, do you start when you have enough open flowers or when you have enough open flowers during decent pollination weather? How much time of good pollination weather is necessary before you can assume you've got pollen on the king blooms?
Great question. Okay, so, and we'll talk a little bit about this when I go into some of the research that we have done as well. But we know that our European honeybees tend to be fussy and they don't really fly that much below 55 degrees, and typically they like temperatures in the 60s and 70s and above to really have good flight. They don't like to fly when it's raining out either. Some of our native pollinators tend to be a little less fussy and they might be out and about. That really depends on your specific conditions in your orchard. So yes, the model is assuming good pollination weather and adequate pollen availability and good flight by pollinators. And when those factors are not met, it's something to weigh as to how many flowers you want open to start the model clock. And at that point, we don't really have a good model for saying, how much more time do you need? I think that is something that an area of that'd be great to have some additional research in, but it really comes down to the manager of the orchard to use their intuition and knowledge to say, I think we have good pollination.
In your experience, what have you found enough time to be? A day with good king bloom open and bee activity?
Yes. When conditions are right and the bees are flying and you have adequate pollinizers in your orchard, either other varieties or crabapple trees, usually within a few hours they're out there. And if you're flowers are open and receptive, they often get pollinated within just a few hours. Okay, so this slide is just showing the same in a larger scale, and I think I may have just kind of went ahead and talked about most of this already in the previous slide. And it's the same data again. So the model clock started at May 5th, 12 o'clock. These are the pollen tubes growing up to the style, and it's 111% the length of the style here. We put on the caustic thinning spray. We start the clock back to 0. Pollen tubes are again growing to the base of the style. We put on the application at 70% the length of the style because we don't want these to be fertilized. We wanted these flowers here and that first curve to get fertilized. We do not want these to be. And then I don't think this is just the end run of the model here. In most years, in our conditions in New York State and the work I did at Virginia Tech, we found that 2 applications was often adequate for achieving acceptable thinning. In Washington State and other parts of the Western US, I've heard of growers typically putting on 3, sometimes even 4 applications in a year if they have a really big bloom or if they have a lot of rat tail bloom they're trying to get rid of. Okay, so there are some parts of this that the growers that you'll need to do, right? It's not a fully automated system. It does require some level of work on your behalf to figure this all out. And so the first thing you have to do is for every variety that you want to thin, you actually have to measure the style length. And the picture in the center of the slide there shows what we're talking about, the top of the stigma to the base of the style, and that is the length of the style. And let me see if I can get out of here for a second. And I have a short little video from Keith Yoder, my colleague at Virginia Tech. Keith has done a lot of work to really push this model forward. So I'll just show a couple of these slides here. And so the King Bloom style samples should be taken as early as possible to establish the average style length. And so really you are going to be taking those measurements as soon as the first King Blooms open. And that should give you typically between 2 and 5 days before you put on your application of your first thinning spray. Okay, so there is enough variability among varieties and even within one variety from one year to the next that we recommend measuring this again every single year on every single variety that you want to use the pollen tube growth model on. We find that somewhere between 25 and 50 flowers is what's needed to get a robust mean of the style length for each block. And then as we showed you in the previous picture, there's a number of different styles within each of the flowers, each individual flower, and what you want is the longest style from each flower. Okay, and so then you're going to add those up somewhere between 25 and 50. I'd recommend doing 50 if you haven't done this before. After you have a little bit of experience, you can go down to 25. And when Dan talks about the new application of the pollen tube model, he'll explain some of the cool features that we have for entering in this data right into the website. And so in some varieties, as shown above, the styles may be longer than the stamens, and others, the stamens may be longer than the style. So one of the fun things that you learn when you start doing this is how variable apple flowers are, and it's just cool and fun to look at. And so this is just showing, where you want to measure to the bottom. The top is pretty easy. It's pretty easy to see where the top of the stigma is on top of the style, but at the bottom it can be confusing. And so if you can see the red line on the right-hand side there, that's basically if you push down the petals and then kind of down to the base of the calyx there, that's what you're looking at. And that's the length that you want to measure. And that's really important because we're talking about an overall length of just a couple centimeters, or often even less. And so, you know, small variability in how you're measuring the bottom of the style can affect your results. And so here's when clearing away the filament and the anther, so you can just see the style, and that's kind of where the base is, where you want to be measuring to the bottom of. And you can use a ruler. We typically use calipers in my lab to measure this. It sounds like a lot at first, but you'll find that once you've done this a few times, it actually goes very quickly. And so it can be either be done on the tree, or you can actually remove the flowers and do this off of the tree. I typically prefer to do it off of the tree. I just find it to be a little easier to go out with a Ziploc bag, pre-label it, go collect my flowers, go back to somewhere where it's more conducive to focusing, and have my calipers there, have a piece of paper with me, or go right into the NUA website and enter in the data. And that's how it looks on the AgWeatherNet. So I'm going to stop sharing this screen now and go back to my PowerPoint. Okay. So just to review, I mentioned this previously, but starting the model clock is one of the more difficult aspects of this because it requires some user experience and expertise. You need to have sufficient bloom, king bloom open, because those king blooms are what you want to be your desired crop load for that year. Some ways of doing that is you can actually do counting flowers per branch or tree cross-sectional area. So if you knew you wanted, 6 fruit per cross-sectional area, you can actually count that out. You can measure it and count it. And I'd say even, just 3-5 years ago, that seemed to be a major barrier for a lot of growers. And I think with work that pomologists are doing in New York and Michigan and Massachusetts, around the country, really, growers are more comfortable with and more used to needing to count to get their desired crop load. And so that also is a part of this model. Sometimes growers just have a good sense for it. You can drive through an orchard and figure out when enough flowers are open. But if this is the first time doing it, I definitely recommend counting. And again, the model starts when the last flower that you need to achieve the desired crop load has been pollinated is open. Okay, and the first thinning spray is when the is applied when the pollen tube growth has been modeled to grow beyond the longest style, right? So 100%, and then usually a tad more, like I showed you that that graph previously that showed 111%. And then additional thinning sprays are put on to prevent additional fertilization. And we already mentioned some of the conditions for bee flight, and also the, we just know that there's a lot of variability for when flowers open within a tree, within an orchard, high points versus low points in terms of the topography. And so these are just kind of some of the things that you have to account for and think about when you're using this model. So currently we have developed these empirical pollen tube growth models for 7 varieties that you see in the top left. These are chosen largely because Washington State Tree Fruit Research Commission paid for a lot of this research early on, and these were the varieties that they were focused on in Washington State. And so on the right there is how the model has been implemented in Washington State, and it's getting a lot of use there. I think bloom thinning has become one of the most common ways of crop load management in the state, in Washington State. They actually find more efficacy from bloom thinning than they do from 10 millimeter thinning using plant growth regulators, just because their climatic conditions are different than what we find in New York or other parts of the eastern US. And a little bit of the history of how the model was developed is there as well. But we're really excited by is started working with NUA in 2018 to get the model available for us in the eastern United States on our weather system. And last year we had it fully available on NUA, and it will be again this year. And so in a moment I'll pass it off to Dan, who will talk about how that's done. But I do want to point out, just some of the known limitations. We talked about bee activity, pollen availability, that kind of went over that already. We only have models for those 7 varieties right now. There's work underway for developing additional models, and also some work that we're trying to do in my lab to develop kind of a universal or generic model that may not be as precise as a cultivar-specific variety, cultivar-specific model, but one that could be used for, we just grow so many more different types of apple varieties here in the eastern U.S. Some questions about the efficacy or the mode of action of different bloom thinners, and I'll talk a little bit more about organic use of bloom thinning for organic orchards, which is really the only chemical thinning that's available for organic orchards right now, is to be bloom thinning, or if you're not using something very caustic later. So Dan, I'm going to pass it off to you. I'm going to stop my share. Dan and I published a paper in the Fruit Quarterly that's available for free now on their website about how the model is implemented. But Dan is going to talk right now about how the model works on NUA. So Dan, you should be able to share your screen now.
Great. Greg, can you just confirm that you can see my shared screen?
Your screen is up. You're good to go.
Okay, great. Yeah, so this has been a really interesting partnership the past couple of years. Looking through some of the chat comments, I see some familiar names, but I also see a bunch of new folks. So just very quickly, I want to mention that NUA is short for the Network for Environment and Weather Applications. It's a website, but it's really a lot more than that. It's a decision support system. So really, we have a lot of fruit resources and tools on here that I and especially my predecessor, Dr. Julie Carroll, have developed really since the early 90s. And one of the reasons that the pollen tube growth model is on here, in my opinion, is because we really are a true collaboration. What I want to do is just zoom out a little bit to show you the full extent of our network. So what you're seeing here is, and I'm actually going to zoom out even further because there's some exciting new locations out in the western US. So Utah has now come on board. But if we come back into the eastern United States, we've got over 700 physical weather stations linked to every single tool on NUA. And so when we talk about providing the pollen tube growth model as a resource to all of you as growers in Eastern New York and New England, we really have good coverage. It's possible because we work with our neighboring states, Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, all coming together to make this resource available. So I just wanted to mention that very quickly. When we start talking specifically about the pollen tube growth model, you can access it one of 2 ways. So if you look up here, we have our standard navigation bar. If you go to crop management, you'll see the apple pollen tube growth right here. So if you just click on that, it will redirect you to ptgm.nua.cornell.edu. We're actually in a transition phase, which is why the pollen tube growth model looks different from our old website. That's a different story. If we have time at the end of the seminar or offline, I can answer questions about that, but we're transitioning to a new web design in November. But for now, if you go to this URL, this is the landing page for what Greg and Julie and myself and our colleagues at the Northeast Regional Climate Center who do our programming have released. So everything Greg has been talking about over the past 45 minutes is built in here. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to walk through and I'm literally going to build my own personal profile using all of these neat features that are available to you. The only other thing I'll add is that if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat box. And Mike and Greg, maybe you can just keep track. If there's something that's very timely as I'm doing something, definitely jump in. Otherwise, I can circle back once my little portion here is done. I don't want to take too much time, but I do want to show you how this works. So the first thing you want to do is establish a block. You can think of this as like a standard management unit. So if we're talking about different apple varieties or different parts of your farm, it's really up to you. But to start the process, you're going to click block. So that opens up this window. You can enter a block name, and I'm just going to put in sample block for these purposes. And then in the next drop-down field is where you select your apple variety. And again, Greg already pointed out that research has been done on a core set of varieties here. So I think I'll select Honeycrisp for this demo. And then the next field, you select your state of interest. And for the purposes of what we're doing here, I'm going to use a station that I know works here in Geneva, New York. But you'll see that there are 168 available locations across the state. If you were to change this to Massachusetts, I know we've got a few folks from Massachusetts here, this is automatically going to update. So now you see that there are 52 locations available in Massachusetts and so on and so forth. But again, if we go back to New York and then simply scroll down and select Geneva, it's in alphabetical order. This is going to get us started. So this will give you a baseline to build your model from. So we're going to hit add block. And you see that now I have a list. It's a list of 1 right now. But I will mention the first of our neat features is that if you have multiple blocks or management units, you can add as many as you want. The way this model works right now that we're looking at is it stores it in your local browser cache. So any information you add is going to be stored as long as you don't clear that information out. This is kind of a compromise until the new website launches, where we're going to have profile systems and saved settings so that you don't even ever have to worry about cached data anymore. But for now, that's how it works. And so this basic block here, you'll simply see a list of 2, 3, 4 different management units. So to get the model started, once you create your sample block here, you want to select a start date. And we can go back in time to do this. And what I'd like to do is go back to 2019, and I will start at May 5th, just like Greg was talking about in his screenshots. So you can navigate through this calendar, which is available again by clicking start date. And I believe it was maybe May 5th, which I wrote down. And then you can also select time because this model is very time sensitive. So if you do that, you're going to see available hours within the single day of May 5th. This is a 24-hour selection, so 1,800 hours is going to be 6 p.m., I believe. So select that, and then this should populate. And there we go. So now we have a model start date. The next step is where we start to enter our data for style length. And this is where we get to the second really neat feature. You have 2 options for inserting your style length. You can insert an average style length, or like Greg said, if you're out in the field or you want to be very precise, you can have the model do a calculation. So I actually want to do this to show you the full features. So we're going to collect a series of style lengths. And again, this is just for demo. I am not a horticulturist, but I'm just going to put in a couple of sample lengths. Maybe we'll start with 9 millimeters. And I should say it's always millimeters. It's not inches or centimeters. So that's important to know. If you put in anything other than that, it will update. Okay, so we have our first measurement. I'll just put in 3 measurements. So let's say 9 millimeters was your first length. Let's put in 8.5. So you're gonna do that. It's doing that, and what it's doing is it's taking an average of all the different lengths. So let's do one more, just for kicks here. And it'll take just a second. So now I've got 3 style lengths, and so the average is 8.5. So I'm gonna close out of this, and so now the model has started. What you're seeing here is a time frame of May 5th all the way to December 31st. And I think what we want to do for this time period is really narrow that down, because you're interested in thinning those blooms really in this early part of May. What I will point out is that you can drag your cursor anywhere along this accumulation curve, and it's going to show you a number of things. Let me just adjust this a little bit so that you can see some of these things that are customizable. What I really want to do is I want to adjust that end date. So right now it's set to December 31st. To get to this interface, I'm clicking on this little pencil icon. So when I hover over it, it says Edit Block. This is where everything else goes into the model. So I'm just going to go down here, and we're going to go back to May 2019, April, and I think we'll just work, I'll choose May 20th for now. So when you click that and hit Update Block, it's going to give you a much more manageable time frame. Even that maybe is a little bit beyond the scope of what we want to do, so let me adjust it once more. But you can see how flexible this is. If something doesn't fit my needs, I'm able to adjust it right away, and everything is being saved, and that looks a lot better. So now we can revisit what Greg was telling us about targeting that date of first spray to get to 110%. So emergence, 110% is happening May 9th at 2300 hours. So let's keep that in our mind. Down here, we have a button that will change. So I'm going to enter the first spray, but after I do that, it's then going to say set second spray. But let's go ahead and do the first one. And I think we said May 18th. We'll select 2300 hours. And that was not it. I'm sorry. So I was looking at May 9th. So again, let me back up here. So this is a great example of why we have a customizable model. So if I go into Edit Block, I've already entered my first spray, and you could see, well, I can't go back to change that if I want to. If you open up your Edit function by clicking on this pencil icon, you can change your first spray. So if you go in here and we go back to May 9th, 2300 hours, and update the block, there it is. So there's our first spray. And according to what Greg is chatting with us about, we did a pretty good job of targeting that 110% growth point. Which
Dan, I'm going to interrupt here just real quickly and just mention that. So, what Dan's showing us now is the model using 2019 weather data. So it's a little bit, all the weather data is already there. But for 2020, when you're actually doing this in real time and you're trying to figure out when to put that application on, the really cool thing is that NUA pulls in weather forecast data. So you can look out, I forget what it is, Dan, I think it's 5 days into the future.
That's correct. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
And so you actually, you know what the recorded temperature is up to the, the current time. Usually the hour before. Newer stations are really quick these days for updating the recorded data. But then you can project forward up to 5 days to figure out when you're going to get to 100% of the style length.
That's a really good point. So maybe what I'll do is I'll just set a second spray in here just to get a sense of what we can get from historical data, but I think there may be a couple of stations that we can access in real time here for the current year. So I'll just finish describing what the features are, and then we can certainly look at that real time feature. So if we set the second spray for, let's see, it was 70%, Greg, is that right?
Yeah, that'd be good.
Okay. So we get to 70% on May 14th at 9 a.m. Let's go back to May 14th at 9 a.m. We'll get that second application there at 70%. And then you can see that achieves the goal. So if we want to look at current data, I'm actually going to very quickly reset this and create another block. We'll use current data. I'll just use Honeycrisp again. And then maybe we'll go, Greg, do you think there are areas, or Mike, areas in the Hudson Valley that would be at the point where they're looking at pollen tube thinning?
Probably not quite yet. I think
Okay, so
Lower Hudson Valley is probably at pink, from what I understand.
Okay, so I'll go a little bit further south, maybe Pennsylvania or New Jersey. How about, let's try New Jersey, and then how about, we'll just see what happens with Princeton. Okay, so the start date, we'll use March 10th, see how that works, and then we'll just enter an average style length this time in the interest of time. Click OK. All right, yeah, so let's say 110% is on May 19th or March 19th, around 1900 hours. So let's do that very quickly. March 19th, 1900 hours. And then I'll just enter another one here, March 25th at 11, and then I'll talk about the forecast data. So you get a sense of the flexibility that's built in here. What we're seeing over here with this lighter shade area, this is the forecast information. So if we're at March 31st right now, this takes you out to April 1st in this scenario, but you are getting that forecast. And by coincidence, it ends at 100%. I didn't plan that. So that's how the model itself works. There's a couple of other visualization features. We have a growth table down here. It's the same data. It just is in a tabular format. And then you can also display the growth graph underneath, and these display sequentially. If you want to turn them off, you can turn them off, and so on and so forth. Are there any questions at this point? Greg, if you want to jump in, if there's anything else I'm not covering, please definitely. It's really great to be on the same webinar with you because we can come at this from both ends. Okay, well, if not, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. If other questions do come up, I'm going to stay on until the webinar is over. But I'm going to turn it back over to Greg.
Great. Thanks, Dan. And I'll just also say that there's both a web-based version and like an iOS version of the pollen tube growth model that's available. It's not a separate app, it's just within the NUA website for now. I think app plans are in the works, but not quite available for 2020 yet.
That is a good point. So the website, so what we were looking at is responsive. So we don't have a separate app, but you can access it from any device, and it's going to respond to the size of your screen. So if you really do want to take your smartphone out in the orchard and do those measurements, you can enter them directly without having to come back to the office.
And just to follow up on that, one of the key things then is to remember that because the data is being stored locally, either on your computer or your phone, you can't enter the data in one and see it in the other device for the time being. That will change shortly. Dan and his team are working on allowing all this to be a cross-platform system, but it's a lot of development work on their side. So for 2020, you'll have to either enter it in twice or just use your phone, use your computer, whichever one it is.
Great, thanks.
All right, so to go back now to my slides, let's see here. Yep, okay. And so I want to go over a little bit about the different materials that can be used for thinning. And I'd have to say this is one of the more frustrating aspects of doing all this work. I really enjoy the physiology and learning about pollen tube growth. When we get out and trying to use this in the field, we've come across a number of barriers for implementation related to different labels. And that's because chemical companies are concerned about their products being used in such a way that either causes overthinning, causes damage to the fruit. It's just sometimes outside of their comfort zone or what they feel that their products were designed to do. However, many of these products that are available, the way they work for flower thinning tends to be because they're caustic. They're causing some sort of burning on the plant tissue itself. And so when that happens, you can cause damage to foliage, but if you damage the fruit surface, especially you damage it right at the point of king bloom opening to petal fall, there isn't, the fruit has not developed a very thick epicuticular wax yet. And so damage is more likely to happen then than even using these products 2 or 3 weeks later. So this slide here is a list of some of the different products that are available. I would say lime sulfur is the most commonly used flower thinner. It is often used with an oil. In Washington State, where conditions tend to be lower humidity conditions tend to be what they have during bloom. They tend to have less russeting. So sometimes they'll use up to a 5% lime sulfur solution without an oil. We found in our work that lower rates of lime sulfur with an oil is recommended for minimizing the amount of fruit russeting that can happen. Ammonium thiosulfate, ATS, it's a fertilizer, it's a nitrogen fertilizer. It's commonly used for both apple and peach thinning. It's again caustic. There's no specific label for thinning, but it is one that is commonly used as a fertilizer at the same time that you might be thinning. And I'll probably say the same about lime sulfur. I have another slide where I'll go over some of the lime sulfur products that are available. Regalia, which is a biofungicide developed by and sold by Marone Biosciences. It's effective for a number of different diseases, but Keith Yoder, as a pathologist, saw it in a trial, and he saw that there was some petal burning, and he said, while that might be a negative to some people's mind, he was also working on the pollen tube model for flower thinning and said maybe this is something that has the potential to be used as a flower thinner. And so we've done a lot of work on this. We found it effective at a number of different rates. I'll show you that slide in a minute, but it's best used with an oil. When it's used without an oil, it tends to be less efficacious. And there has been some product formulation changes in the past couple years. And we think that the newer formulation should work as well as the older formulation, but we haven't had an opportunity yet to test them side by side. We found pretty minimal thinning results from both Maxell or 6-BA, 6-benzyladenine, and NAA. The number of different company name brands are shown there. Neither of them, while these are really common thinners for 10 millimeter thinning, we did not find either of them to be particularly effective for flower thinning. We did find some positive results for NAD, which is the kind of an analog compound. It's an oxidant very similar to NAA. It's an older material for petal fall thinning, and for whatever reason, with the specific chemistry differences between NAD and NAA, we found NAD to be a better thinner for flowers than NAA. And then various salts have been tried. Potassium carbonate, sodium chloride, that's just table salt, have really been inconsistent in their effects for flower thinning. So since I mentioned that lime sulfur is really the most common flower thinner, I've tried to get in touch with a number of the different manufacturers, because there's always been label restrictions that have made it difficult to recommend using lime sulfur for flower thinning, even though we know it can be efficacious. It can be used safely if the proper precautions and knowledge are in place. But again, some chemical companies, Miller in particular, which is available and registered in New York State, specifically says on their label to not use the product for crop thinning. And they also have other comments in there about not using it with oil. So they recommend its use for as a fungicide at pink and at petal fall, but they do not at this time recommend it for crop thinning. Brandt is also potentially interested in getting a label in New York, but there is not one available yet, and they have very specific guidance to not use it with an oil, which I think would be a mistake in New York State. NovaSource has the most specific language related to bloom thinning, and their label allows for its use in Idaho and North Carolina, Oregon, Pennsylvania, Utah, Virginia, and Washington, but unfortunately not New York. They are seeking registration for New York. It's held up at the EPA right now, and they, with everything that's happening, it's most likely not to get approval in time for 2020. Hopefully for 2021, that'll be the lime sulfur product that will most likely be available for us in New York. And then Rex makes a product called Orcal. This is the most commonly used lime sulfur product in Washington State. They have a very specific label for Washington. They do not have product registered in New York at this time, but they are looking into whether or not New York's a big enough market to go through that process. So, just put on my extension hat here and just remind everybody to always check with your local regulatory bodies and extension offices to find out what products are available. Okay, so I'm going to go through some slides now and talk a little bit about some of the results from some of our trials using the model. So this one
Greg,
was... Oh,
before you go on, we do have a question coming in.
Yeah, please.
Levi's asking, he says he believes he currently uses post-bloom thinners. What would you say are the main benefits switching to blossom thinning or using both?
Mm-hmm. So, and I talked about this a little bit earlier, but there's a number of reasons why you want to start thinning earlier, right? And so we talked about increasing fruit size, better return bloom, and less biennial bearing when you're doing bloom thinning. And I'll mention this in a little bit too, but I really think that bloom thinning is a tool, it's a practice. to be used in concert with a number of other crop load management tools. And so if you've been following the work by entomologists in New York and Michigan and other places, they're talking about this precision crop load technique where you kind of whittle away at your crop load until you get to a very precise number of fruit per tree. And so that is done through pruning, it's done through blossom thinning, petal fall thinning, 10 millimeter thinning, etc. And so this is another tool in the toolbox for you.
Thanks, Greg.
So this froze up for a sec here. Okay. So this is a project, we did this in 2013 on a Honeycrisp orchard in Virginia, larger trees, 111 rootstock. And here we were trying to do is to look at a number of different chemistries that can be used for bloom thinning. So again, here's the model. We started it on April 23rd in the early morning. Looks like somewhere around 8, 9 o'clock in the morning. You can see here's the pollen tube growth rate. Oopsie, going up. Here's our black line, here is our style length, and the dotted line is our diurnal temperatures. Okay, and the first application went on April 30th, and then a second application went on lost the date there, but at some point later. And so here are the results. So again, this is kind of just a, hey, what kind of products can we use for blossom thinning? This is our check at the bottom. We had almost 10 fruit per branch cross-sectional area in the check, way too many. And you can see many of these products, really not much efficacy. ABA, Ethifon, Pomaxa, which is an NA formulation, lime sulfur. You can see we're getting now, if you look at the letters, statistical letters, anything that it does not have an A is different than the control. So we get a reduction in thinning with Pomaxa, lime sulfur, and you can see Maxell. And then this is lime sulfur by itself. And you can see here, again, I was recommending lime sulfur with oil, one of the most efficacious products. Amethyn, that's the NAD product. Again, we're showing some good efficacy, and ATS, very, very strong blossom thinner. This is a 10 millimeter check, and this is kind of a hand thinned check. For a grower, you're probably on Honeycrisp wanting to get somewhere between 4 and 6 fruit. So some of these may have thinned too much, but again, this is a research trial, not necessarily for the grower, with no additional thinning after the bloom thinning went on. This is a project we did on Golden Delicious. Again, we're looking at materials that different types of materials that can be used for thinning. This one we were looking specifically for organic materials that can be used for organic orchards. Here's the model. Here's our diurnal temperatures, day, night, up and down, translating into the pollen tube growth rate. Our first thinning spray, we put it on shy of the style length, okay? So this was probably a little early in this experiment, and that was, some years are like that based on the weather conditions. The next day it might have been predicted to rain, and we knew that we couldn't get the material on, and so we decided to go ahead and put the spray on early. Sometimes you have to make these compromises. In Washington State, there's less compromises because their weather tends to be more consistent. For us, we find these sorts of things happen a little bit more often. And then the second spray went on, again, less than the style length. And so let's look at the results. This is looking at a number of different materials. We'll look at these three right here. This is Regalia. This is the knotweed extract that I mentioned. We found it to be fairly rate insensitive. So 2, 4, and 6 quarts per 100 gallons were all pretty much the same results, and they all reduced crop load relative to the control that had an A. These do not have A's, so they're statistically different than the control. And then lime sulfur seems to numerically, at least, maybe not statistically, but numerically reduce at these various different rates and different application methods, crop load relative to Regalia, and certainly a lot less than the control. It's a project that we did looking at trying to combine different materials in organic production for both crop load management and for disease management. And as I mentioned, a lot of the products that are used for bloom thinning have disease management aspects to them. And so we're seeing, one, can we justify the use of them as fungicides or as disease control materials, but also can we get some double duty out of them? Can we both manage crop load and manage diseases with them? So that's just kind of the objective. Some of the diseases that we're concerned with: cedar apple rust, quince rust, which affect apples during bloom. And then this is the experimental setup. So it's kind of no treatment control. And then we had a lime sulfur at 10 millimeter, because that's an organic practice that some growers were using, a hand thinned control. And then we did these kind of different combinations of lime sulfur and regalia, each time with an oil. So lime sulfur followed by lime sulfur, same timing, lime sulfur with regalia, regalia, and then regalia and lime sulfur. Okay, so all the applications went on the same time for the bloom thinning, and all the applications for the first application and the second application. So again, here's our pollen tube growth rate. Here's our style length. We're just over the style length. That was a really good use of the model in this year. Application 2 went on, maybe could have let it go on a little bit longer, but again, specific weather conditions that year probably said, let's go ahead and do this now and not wait. And that's just kind of how you have to use this model. And then some of the results, you can see that they all reduced crop load relative to the control. In our previous work, we'd found lime sulfur to be a stronger thinning agent than regalia. So we're kind of seeing about what happens if we can control, a strong thinner with a somewhat weaker thinner. We found some numerical difference, but not statistical differences. They all have that letter B after the meaning that they're statistically equivalent to each other. Just looking at which flowers got fertilized. Just for the sake of time, I won't go into all the details and nuance in this. I do want to discuss this slide, however, and say that russeting can be an issue. And so this is the x-axis here is % of harvested fruit with russet, and you can see that it's considerable, right? Our hand thin, no russeting, and even lime sulfur at 10 millimeter, no russeting. But the applications that we did during bloom all had russeting to varying degrees. And what we think was that lime sulfur, particularly when it was the second spray, happened when it was quite humid out. And that lime sulfur application, when it's humid out, can cause a lot of russeting. So that's something to really keep in mind when you're using that product specifically for flower thinning. It's kind of what the foliage and the petals on the flowers look like after these different applications. And you can see the bottom left, how much damage there was to the petals. And on the bottom right, this is lime sulfur at 10 millimeter. Even though it caused minimal amounts of fruit russet, you can see how damaging it was to the foliage. And so again, right at when the during flowering and up through petal fall, there's just a very thin layer of wax, of epicuticular wax, to protect that fruit, and that's when these materials can be most damaging. And so we did find, and I'll provide these slides later. Won't go into all the nuanced detail here, but we did find efficacy for disease control from these products, as well as with as thinning agents. So we were able to show some double duty there. And then just some additional trials. These are in New York and different product combinations. Again, what I want to show you here is that our temperatures in 2017 were quite cool all through the bloom period. And we had this really elongated time between starting the model and putting on our first thinner. We didn't even get to the green line, which is our style length in this picture. And I think it's one of the issues, we did a lot of this work in Virginia. We showed its efficacy really well in Virginia, also in Washington State. As you move further north, one of the things we're finding is that colder temperatures during bloom really make it a lot more challenging to use this model And so there's going to be some years where it's going to not always work or not always work as well. And that's just something that we're learning and something to keep in mind. Again, I won't go into all the details here, but what we're looking at is crop load, number of apples per, this is in branch cross-sectional area, some work by Peter Herzeal, and finding some good efficacy again by regalia and lime sulfur. Just kind of what the picture looks like. A similar situation happened in 2018, cool weather during bloom, a little bit warmer, but it made it really challenging, again, to know when to start the model clock and when to put on the first application. And point out that, again, we found good results with both the use of lime sulfur and oil and regalia and oil as bloom thinners. And just kind of similar stuff there. So this slide here is just showing you some of the local resources of people who have been using the bloom thinning model in different parts of the country. Some people that you might want to contact if you're outside of New York in terms of getting some assistance, getting some local input. I've mentioned this already. There's a lot of nuance into, you know, where you're located in terms of the efficacy of these different products, and also in terms of the pollen tube growth rates. And so just some concluding remarks here. Bloom thinning can be, and I think it should increasingly be used in the eastern US. I've given you a lot of caveats as to when it does work, when it might not work as well. I think really targeting varieties where fruit size is an issue and thinning early, such as Gala, is important. And also thinning really biennial varieties such as Fuji and Honeycrisp. 2020 is looking to be a really big year for Honeycrisp bloom, because last year was kind of off. And so I think it's something to look at for Honeycrisp blocks this year. Also, when Honeycrisp, for example, blooms later, or when temperatures tend to be a little warmer, and that also makes the model work somewhat better. You may be able to reuse some of your fungicide sprays. Just lots of warnings about russeting can be an issue. That has to do more with the materials that you might select over the model. It's how the model is being implemented, but just something to keep in mind. And I mentioned this already, but making bloom thinning part of a whole model for crop load management on your farms. I just want to put up an acknowledgement slide and thank various funding agencies and all the different technicians and grad students who have worked on this project over the years. There's been a lot of work that's gone on to this. It's been going on for 15 plus years now. Really, a lot of this, again, was focused on Washington State, and we're really excited to see this work get implemented in New York and other parts of the eastern US. So a little joke for you. If you're Morris and you have questions, now is a good time to ask them.
So Greg, I do see a couple questions coming through. The first one is, does foliar nutrient program pre-bloom influence the rate of the pollen tube growth?
We haven't looked at that specifically. What we do know is certainly orchards with sufficient nitrogen content tend to have healthier bloom overall. We also know that some nutrients such as boron and zinc can affect pollen tube growth. And if you have orchards that are deficient in those elements, that you should be looking to increase those levels to get them to an adequate range.
Great. And then we have another two questions. How does ATS compare to the organic materials as far as russeting is concerned?
ATS can also cause russeting. I would be, so here's russeting is worse when you have high humidity And the reason why high humidity is an issue is because you typically have slow drying times. And so the material tends to stick around on the surface for a long time. And so no matter whether you're using ATS, lime sulfur, etc., I would look at the humidity that's happening. And if it's really humid conditions, to either back down on the rates or try to adjust your timing somewhat. You know, it's a little tricky because as a physiologist, I'm thinking like, okay, let's get the timing just right based on the pollen tubes, but there's all these other factors that need to be considered as a grower.
Would you recommend using the model for varieties that are not currently supported by NUA? If so, you know, can you think of any substitutions, or are there resources for which varieties you might be able to substitute in?
So that's a really big challenge. And as I mentioned, the 7 varieties that we have models for currently are really based on the varieties, you know, the predominant commercial varieties in Washington State. We know we grow a lot more varieties. We have a lot more diversity in New York and other parts of New England. At this time, I can't say, you know, specifically we don't have a replacement list. It's something that we've actually put in a proposal to get some funding to do, to either generate a model that can be used more universally, or even try to come up with, I think as the person who asked the question suggested, is, you know, can we group varieties by like slow, medium, fast, and then figure out which models work best? And I think that's achievable, but we don't have that data currently.
Sure. Then another question, what about lime sulfur regalia without oil? Maybe less effective for thinning, but maybe less russeting and better return bloom?
So a couple questions in there. So to get enough thinning out of lime sulfur without oil, you're talking at starting at about 3.5%, 3.5, you know, gallons per 100-gallon tank, if you think about it that way, and going up to about 5 gallons per 100-gallon tank. I think you're going to have a lot more russeting with that. I would rather see a grower reduce their lime sulfur rate down to 1% if they're concerned about russeting, and leaving the oil somewhere between 1 and 2%. The second part of that question is about return bloom. Return bloom is going to be based on how much fruit you're removing from the tree early in the season. And so if you have poor thinning, you're probably not going to improve return bloom. So lime sulfur and or regalia is really the active component of that mix, and the oil is just helping as a surfactant, getting it into the tree.
Great, thanks, Greg. Any other questions for Greg?
And Mike did offer that I would answer questions about some of my other research activities around hard cider or soil health as well. I'm happy to answer those questions. And Dan's still on the line too if you have questions about NUA, and I'm sure he'd be happy to answer any questions related to NUA.
Greg, can you speak to the rates for ATS?
Let me go back and see what we've tried. So do we have ATS in our trials? I think it goes way back here that we had an ATS in here. Yeah, so we were using 3.5% in this trial here. I think you can get efficacy down well below that, 2%. But you know, it's going to be a trade-off, and if conditions are humid, or you have varieties that you think are going to be prone to russeting, you may get less thinning activity, but also less russeting with these materials. And so you have to balance those in your mind and consider your risk to reward scenario with this. You know, none of them are perfect, but they have different applications in there that make them useful. We did find less russeting with regalia. over lime sulfur.
So Greg, another question. Do you always want to dry as quickly as possible with ATS and lime sulfur? And a follow-up, temperature sensitivity with either of those at certain temperatures?
Yeah, okay. So the first question on humidity, lower humidity is going to result in less russeting, and that's why in Washington State they tend to use higher rates than we can use in New York State or in Virginia and get by without russeting. It's because of lower humidity. So again, lower rates with oil is better than a higher rate by itself. And remind me, I got distracted by my dog. What was the second part of that question, Mike? Oh, temperatures.
High temperature sensitivity?
Yes. So I would avoid using these materials above 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Does not happen too often during bloom for us in this part of the country, but things are changing. Climate is changing rapidly. And anything below 75 degrees, you tend to start losing some efficacy from these materials. I'd say once you're below 70, it's probably not worth it.
Okay. From Chris, we used ATS at 2%, but without oil and had medium efficacy. Would you consider adding oil to ATS or not?
I can't speak specifically to that. I have not tried ATS with oil, and I do not know what that combination would be like. So Dan screams no. I'm not sure which Dan that is, but somebody's screaming no.
Not Dan Olmsted.
Dan says no. Okay.
So Greg, just to confirm, you said these materials will not work below 70 degrees?
Maybe I should not have said it that way. That might have been a little stronger. You lose efficacy when you go down below 70, and you're probably, so in some of our work, we've put this on. I can show you here. We can look at this exactly. Our temperatures here were in the high 50s, and we still had good control. So I don't know. I might retract that comment and say that's something I have in my mind. But in truth, if we look at this one, where were we at when we put on our thinning application? Again, in the 70s, I mean the high 50s. And then here, why is this blipping like this? Here our application was, again, probably 12, 13 degrees Celsius. It's all flipping around here, which is, again, in the low 60s. So I'm gonna pull back on that comment about 70 degrees
Okay.
and say, yeah, we've done it at cooler temperatures. You're going to increase your efficacy as you get around 70, and maybe I should say that as being more of an ideal temperature to target. But as I show with the timing, you can't always get all these things to come together in our climate at the same time.
All right. So application at night is probably not a good idea. You want to do it in the warm part of the day.
Yeah, I would say so. Now, with that in balance with the fact that you're putting on chemicals during bloom when bees are flying, and bees are going to be more active during the day. So
Yeah.
things to consider and kind of think through.
Yep.
So Greg, when would you normally apply? What time of day?
So when we've done our work, we've based it on the model as close as we can. We adjust according to specific temperature conditions and looking forward at when it's going to rain, what the wind conditions are going to be like. For growers with a larger acreage, you're going to be looking at, how do you cover enough territory in a certain amount of time? And I think you have to find that ideal spray window. We know that spray windows tend to be pretty short and rare in the springtime as well. Just the temperature tends to be more variable. So we those are just some of the caveats that we've kind of worked with. I think from a modeling perspective, you're trying to get the pollen tube growth rate or pollen tube length to be longer than the style.
Mm-hmm.
And usually I would think about it as, if you're between 90 and 110% of your style length, that's a good target.
All right, any other questions on bloom thinning for Greg? Please keep typing them in.
And I'm looking in the comment box. It was Dan Donahue who said no to ATS with oil. And so I guess he's screaming no and laughing. And so I am guessing that is a something that he is saying is a very bad idea.
With that, I'd like to thank Greg and Dan for joining us today. If you have any more questions on bloom thinning or on any of Greg's other research, whether it be hard cider, sustainable organic production, please stick around. We'd be happy to field those questions from you. So Greg, I do have a question for you on the cider varieties.
Oh, okay.
Just asking in general what kind of research you've done on hard cider varieties.
Okay. That's a big question. And so I will, let me just get a quick link up here. Yeah, so in terms of hard cider, I put a link up in the chat box to our Cornell website for hard cider. And we've really looked at it from a number of different perspectives. Cost of production, what varieties we should be growing for hard cider, how to grow them in terms of crop load management, in terms of harvesting. A lot of our focus is on chemical attributes that are specific to cider varieties. So things such as the phenolics or the tannins that are in apples, as well as acidity, sugar levels, unusual sugars such as sorbitol, the sugar alcohol that's in a lot of Rosaceae plants. Those are things that are interesting to cider producers.
Greg, what's your experience with the Franklin cider apple?
None. I've heard a lot about it. It is, there was a single tree found in a hedgerow in northern Vermont.
Right.
The guy who found it started promoting it. He's kind of he talked it up a lot, got Stark Brothers interested in it. They filed for some legal protection on it and have been promoting it as the next best thing. I believe it to be it's some sort of hybrid crabapple. I'm not sure what the parentage is or percentage is. The little bits I've heard about it on the plus side are that it's fairly annual. It's has very high levels of tannins and acidity, just like a lot of crab apples do.
Yep.
But on the negative side is I've seen an orchard in New York State that was ravaged with fire blight. Franklin cider apple with a lot of fire blight. So I would not believe the promotions that it is completely disease resistant at all, or that it can be used in a no spray situation.
Okay.
We had another question. Oh, go ahead.
I was just follow up. We have some 3-year-old trees we harvested fruit off from last fall of the Franklin, and we found the apple to be a little overpowering in the cider blends. And I don't know if you've gotten any response from more experienced cider makers on whether it's too powerful with tannins and acidity.
So I would, as I mentioned, it's very similar. It is probably in all likelihood a crab apple of some sort. And so I would say it'd be very similar to using, any other crab apple in your blend. And you'd find that the specific phenolic compounds in a lot of crab apples tend to be very strong, but that, in a small percentage of an overall blend, it can add some good mouthfeel and,
Some
you know, add
structure.
some things
Yeah.
to it. But if 100% crabapple cider is often very difficult to drink.
Yeah.
Personally, I find it very challenging. It can be a very abrasive, or bracing, I should say.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Greg, we had another follow-up on thinning. Applying ATS or lime sulfur, best practices for bees in the orchard. And also with the oil, is that damaging to the bees as they're pollinating?
So I don't have specific information on this. What I would say is we need to just be really cautious about any application that happens during bloom, with everything happening around colony collapse disorder. That doesn't mean no thinning, but it does mean just being aware of the issues. I don't know if you, Mike, or if Dan Donahue's still on the call, have any experience or comments about these materials during bloom in terms of bee health.
I'm not too familiar with the bee health side of things. I do know that as far as the application timing, certainly there's that trade-off of trying to hit right at that sweet spot of 100 to 110%. And then the question of what do you do when that 100% happens to fall at 11 p.m. So certainly in the trials that we've done, we've been trying to hit that 100%. But certainly I think it's a compromise there. Yeah. So if you can
I've no experience with effects on bees, but I'd echo Mike's comment that the challenge is the weather in implementing the model. And
yeah, I agree with that, and I've made that comment a few times already. I will say there's some work coming out of Virginia Tech, which I hope will get published in the next year or so, where they looked at, if you start spraying at 70, then 80, then 90, then 100%, and so on, of the style length, like how big of an effect, using the same spray chemicals, how big of an effect does it have on the final fruit set? And so there is some work looking into how much leeway do you have around that 100%? And I think that'll be really valuable once we have that data.
Great, thank you, Greg. Any final questions for Greg before we hop off? All right, I guess not. Well, again, I thank you all for joining us today. Again, we have Greg's and Dan's contacts up here. Thanks to you both for joining us again. Feel free to reach out to Greg at his email, or you can get in touch with Dan Olmsted at the NUA support desk email. And certainly if you're in Eastern New York, feel free to reach out to me if you're from the northern half of the region, or Dan Donahue if you're in the Hudson Valley, if you have any questions on any of this. All right, thanks a lot, everybody.
Thanks again, Mike.
Thank you.
Greg and Dan.